if we go back to Genesis 8, as Glenn has already brought up, and Craig, and in our discussion, we have this statement: while the earth remains, this is a promise made by God, while the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. So the Lord is telling us that from now on there will be regular patterns and cycles, but we are going to get some extremes, and we are going to get very dominant seasons that in the very good world before the flood would not have been quite so dominant. There would have been some variation, but not quite the extremes that we have now. But these regular patterns and cycles with the seasonal extremes are going to go on. And notice it says there will be periods of cold and heat. And we have thousands of years of observations from the people who were there. As Craig said, the most important observations we have are those from the witnesses who were there. Now, we may not have the sort of satellite precise measurements that we have these days, but we do have agricultural history where we know there were cold times, there were hot times, and in between times, and there were periods of drought and ice that have already been mentioned, and all of those are going to impact on the biology and on what people and animals are able to eat. But God also makes a couple of interesting statements that seem to be a bit arbitrary. And this is a rather strange one that gets skipped over quite a lot. The fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth, and upon every bird of the heavens, and upon everything that creeps on the ground, and all the fish in the sea. Now, aren't you frustrated? I know that I am, when some particularly birds fly away before you can get anywhere near them, but I'm not going to hurt them. But there is that innate fear. And as anyone who's tried to catch fish know, that that can be quite difficult. And if animals didn't have some sort of fear and dread from us, we would probably have wiped them out before now. So this is an important change. Before the flood, when everything was very good, or even going back before the fall, there wouldn't have been any fear on the earth, either from man or the animals, because everything was very good, so there was nothing to fear. But this is a statement made by God that this is a significant change in the general ecology and in the relationship between people and animals. Right. And God then goes on to explain why. Into your hands these are delivered. And here is a really significant change in the way people and animals live. Every moving thing that lives shall be yours for food. And as I gave you the green plants, I give you anything. So God is now making a contrast between what things were like before the flood compared with what things are going to be like after the flood. And so there is a significant change. In the beginning, of course, God created man and the animals to eat plants. Now they're going to be enabled or given permission to eat basically anything that moves. So this is a great difference to the sort of evolutionary diet story that we have from the evolutionary history of human beings. And this is important. You cannot just impose biblical history onto the evolutionary worldview. They are completely different. So the standard story is that most people have in their minds, somehow we evolved from apes, which were vegetarian most of the time. They do occasionally kill each other and other animals, but they're basically vegetarian. Now, somehow evolving hominids lived on a mixed diet, and they discovered fire, or how to control fire, which meant that they could cook food. And these evolved into archaic human beings, which lived as hunter-gatherers. So they went out hunting animals and they went out gathering plant materials, tubers, berries, fruits, things like that. But it was mostly a meat diet that people imagine. And the typical picture is your caveman in his cave cooking the large animal that he and his friends have just been out hunting together. And this is the basis of a lot of people thinking about the so-called paleo diet. There's a lot of interesting research going on now that suggests that cavemen actually ate their greens, because we now have the technology to analyze the remains of plant foods in the pottery and the artifacts that are left inside caves. After that, archaic human beings are somehow evolved into modern human beings who domesticated plants and animals and invented farming. Now, that is the very opposite of the story of human beings that we are told in the Bible, and particularly in the changeover that came from before the flood and after the flood. So let's go back to the Bible diet history, right, or how things have changed from creation through the fall and onto the flood. So in creation, or in the beginning rather, Adam and Eve lived in a beautiful, fruitful garden, and they were told to eat plants. And there were plenty of good, nutritious plants for them to eat with a lot of variety. And all animals ate plants, so they didn't go out and kill one another. This was the very good world, the world of a beautiful, fruitful garden where people ate plants, all animals ate plants. After the fall of man and God cursed the ground, people still cultivated crops for food. And in fact, the judgment that God metes out on Adam specifically mentioned, by the sweat of your brow you will eat your bread. In other words, it's going to become hard work. Now, God did not change what they could eat. It's just that because he cursed the ground, it was going to be much harder work to get that food. We are also told in the next generation, with the story of Cain and Abel, that people were keeping animals. Now, why would they keep animals? Well, we know about sacrifices, and also people now had to wear clothes, and animals are a good source of fibers. So people were initially gardeners. The oldest profession in the world is gardening, right? Then they were farmers. So what happened to get the sort of variety of lifestyles that we have in food gathering that we have through known history? All right. So after the flood, God specifically gives permission to kill and eat animals and birds and fish. Now, there were no restrictions on the kinds of creatures that it says everything that basically moves. So if you could catch it and kill it, it was fair game. We have to remember that the Jewish food laws came in with the law of Moses. And but immediately after the flood, God told Noah and his family, you can now catch and eat anything that moves. Now that means that we have natural and human selection that will determine the survival of both cultivated plants and animals. And the reason for that is that, as we've heard from Glenn and from Craig, the environment drastically degenerated with the extremes of weather that we have after the flood. And that would have led to a lot of natural selection. Natural selection is a real process. Animals really had a hard time surviving in some of the extremes, right? And people did as well. And we have to remember that after the flood, people did stay together for a while, but they were eventually dispersed all over the world after the Tower of Babel. And by that time, a significant amount of degeneration would have happened, and people would have found themselves in very difficult environments where it was not possible to cultivate plants and animals to the intensity that you have with farming. And people would have lost their technology as well when they were scattered. So some people would have lost the ability to farm, and they became hunter-gatherers. So being a hunter-gatherer is not the beginning, it's actually the result of hundreds of years of history due to the degeneration of the environment following the flood. Now, what about animals? Well, animals avoided human beings for survival. God built that in so that we wouldn't wipe them out straight away. But we have managed to wipe out quite a few. There's rather a sad history of human-induced extinction. During this process of degeneration of the environment, animals would have moved out from the site of the flood, from the ark, and they would have to make their own way as best they can. As the environment degenerated, plant foods would have become less nutritious and in some places almost disappear. So animals would make the most of what they could and became scavengers or carnivores. In other words, they started to eat each other. Now, the interesting thing is that we are told that animals evolved to become carnivores. They were almost as it were designed by nature, is one of the common expressions you'll come across in a lot of popular science literature. Because they have things like sharp claws, they have teeth, they have speed and agility that you need for hunting. Now, all of those things we observe in the animal world, in the bird world. Those things do not make an animal a carnivore. We've said numerous times in various programs that we put on, there are plenty of examples of animals that do have sharp teeth and claws, but they eat plants, right? Those things do not make an animal a carnivore, but animals that already have sharp teeth or have claws or have speed and agility needed to hunt, those things don't make an animal a carnivore, but they do facilitate it. So animals that already had those features became carnivores. Animals that didn't had to find a way of surviving in places where there were enough plant foods or they died out. And so here is an example of an animal that has become a carnivore within our observed living memory. The Kia parrot, which is a parrot in New Zealand. It's the world's only alpine parrot. It lives high up in the mountains in New Zealand, and it does have particularly sharp beak, long pointed beak, curved pointed beak, a real weapon of war, as it were. And it does have sharp claws. Now, as we've said many times in creation research, sharp things are very good for cutting, but they don't necessarily have to be for cutting up meat or other animals. They're just as good for cutting up fruit and nuts and shoots. And they're also useful for digging for roots. So this bird is well designed to live on a vegetarian diet, but the same sharp beak and the same sharp claws can also be used to dig up grubs and other invertebrates and things in the soil. Now, in New Zealand, when the wild food became scarce, the parrots started to attack sheep. Now, one of the reasons that the wild food did become scarce was because of the spread of farming, and a lot of trees were cut down, a lot of the wild food sources were removed. And so the parrots are actually very smart, and they will go looking for food wherever they can find it. And they did start to attack sheep. Now, they didn't actually kill sheep directly. I mean, they're a fairly small bird compared with the size of a sheep. However, what they would do is pick at their at their skin and wound them, sometimes quite severely, so that the sheep would die from septicemia and infection. And they were rather a scourge. For a while in New Zealand, there was actually a bounty on them because they were a damage to sheep. Now they've stopped that, I think, back in the early 70s. But nevertheless, this is an example of a creature that is well designed to eat plant foods, but has been observed in living memory to take up eating animal foods. Now that happened many, many times over in the centuries after the flood. So what happens in general to animals and people after the flood in terms of surviving? Well, I think it was rather well summarized in this sign that I came across in one of my visits to Kew Gardens. This was a display about climate change. And as Glenn and Craig have described very well to us tonight, the flood was the most spectacular climate change that's ever happened on the earth. We are observing climate change. It's nothing compared to what's happened in biblical history. And as a result of climate change and the environmental degradation that happened after the flood, animals and people were faced with, how do we cope with this? Well, you can either move to a place where food is available, and so that would account for why certain animals live in particular places over the earth these days. They can adapt. Now, we have to remember that adaptation is not an evolutionary process. It's actually a design feature. Adapt means that you have the ability to cope with changes in the environment using the features you already have. So it does have its limits. So creatures like the Kea parrot, like many other creatures that have sharp teeth and sharp claws, or that have speed and ability, were able to adapt by changing from a plant diet to a meat-based diet, to a carnivorous diet, become birds of prey or animals of prey. And during this process, we have very severe natural and unnatural selection as well, and that means a lot of animals did die out. So move, adapt, or go extinct. That's what's happened after the flood, and it has particularly related to diet and what things were available for animals to eat